Marcuse's preface to the second edition of Reason and Revolution. A note on the dialectic is called. It's the 1960 edition of Reason and Revolution, and he wrote a 6-page preface, which is every word bristles with new ideas. It's just, it's profound Hegelianism. Materialist Hegelianism. Let me say a few things, and then we can talk about the text more directly. Did anybody figure out why Marcuse wrote a whole book on Freud, which is what this is about?
I'm not sure this answers your question, but he's clearly trying to use Freud in a less reactionary way, more revolutionary way.
But why go to Freud?
Well, I think part of it, right, is folks like Erich Fromm were focusing more on sort of the ego and relationship between ego and society, and Marcuse was trying to return to
the whole institute got into Freud. Fromm was a footnote in their view, but he had been in the institute. But the deeper question is why psychoanalysis? Have any of you read Anti-Oedipus by Deleuze and Guattari?
Some of it.
Yeah.
You have.
Some. Several years ago with Michael. Yeah.
What?
Several years ago with Michael. Yeah.
Who's the main influence on that book?
Freud, I would say.
Huh?
I would say, well, the psychoanalysts of the day.
Well, that's true, but the most immediate influence that they continually refer to is Marcuse.
Oh, really? Oh, that's right. Yeah.
You remember now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So his effort was trying to bridge the psychoanalytic community, especially I think he talks about the neo-Freudians especially, and the
neoliberals and the
neo-Freudians, right, and the field of philosophy. So it was, which this book seems to be a significant effort at doing.
Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse, Neumann, Otto Kirchheimer, and Franz Neumann. I mean, most people all considered themselves Marxists, but they observed. It didn't take much to observe, but they observed ubiquitously that Marx and Marxism after Marx had no psychology, and they were convinced that the psychological question, the question of consciousness, the question of perception, the question of the unconscious, and so on, was among the most important features of late capitalism. They always, according to Marcuse, they always presupposed political economy.
Mm-hmm.
Presupposed, but did not themselves, except for Neumann, go deeply into the political economy of their own time. But they said to understand the contradictions at the economic level would not give you an insight into how the system works, and more important, what the revolutionary task is. And so they kept saying that without going deeply into the revolutionary implications of psychoanalysis. Adorno mentions it frequently, Horkheimer not at all practically, but it was to Marcuse's task, whether it was given to him or he himself took it as his task, to try to, as you say, mediate psychoanalysis and historical materials. That was what he was trying to do. And that's what One-Dimensional Man is about, and that's what an essay on liberation is about, and that's what counter-revolution and revolt is about, and especially Eros and Civilization. And remember the date, 1955. You could read this as you did and I did today, and see that it's still quite
Yeah.
salient.
Yeah. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Scary.
What?
It's scary how prescient it is. Within 2 pages, I was wanting to quote to my students, say, when was this written?
And it goes right back to the first Adorno that we read on progress. I mean, doesn't he actually quote him about barbarism? So,
Well, you may. Remember, Marcuse was born in 1898, and Adorno was born in 1903. And so Marcuse is 5 years his senior, and that meant a lot in that period.
How did they spend the First World War?
What?
How did they spend the First World War?
They?
Yeah, if they were
Well,
white.
they didn't have an institute in the First World War.
No, but I'm saying personally. He was 20
Personally?
years old and 16
I think they were. Adorno was in school. Marcuse was in the German army, and then he joined the Spartacus revolt in 1919. He became a political activist with armed struggle. Adorno never and Horkheimer never participated in any social movement. They were theoreticians, which is okay. Marcuse, almost to his dying day, would never take a walk away from some practical struggle. He would always support the practical struggle by appearing, by speaking at it, and sometimes by marching in it. He was a very different kind of figure.
he was very active in the free speech movement at Berkeley, was he not?
No,
No, he wasn't?
he never went to Berkeley. He encouraged them.
But
I mean, but he
Yeah,
was,
but I thought he participated in some of the activities. No. Okay.
He was in he was at that point at UCSD in 1963. He went to UCSD. That was the big year of the free speech movement. And in the first year of his tenure at a university, it's very difficult and maybe not even correct politically to divide your time between theory and practice. But by the next year and the years after that, he had plunged pretty deeply into practical things as far as he could. And certainly in 1955, he was in no position to do that. In 1955, he was unemployed. Unemployed means he had no real job. He was a visiting professor at best, not even a visiting professor. He was a researcher at Columbia University's political science program. when the political science program had luminaries such as Zbigniew, and so on.
Brzezinski.
Oh,
And before that, he worked for the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was the predecessor to the CIA.
right.
That was a real job, by the way. He had that job, the OSS job, and then the CIA. Then he worked for the State Department. He never worked for the CIA itself. The State Department was his job after the war. But the OSS was his first job, which was the Central Intelligence Agency's predecessor. So, what in this book grabbed you? At least the first 106 pages, and the prep and the introduction is in the 106 pages, and the new preface. What about the new preface? What grabbed you about that?
Can I jump way ahead just in response to your question?
What did you say?
Can I jump way ahead in
Yeah.
response to your question? I did not read the preface. I didn't do that. I began at page 1.
Uh-huh.
But the thing that grabbed me, just because of my background, I suppose, was on page 68 and 69, where he refers to, in my estimation, a kind of liberation theology. That is, he interprets the message of Jesus, as Erich Fromm does in The Dogma of Christ, as a basically liberating message from the law in favor of agape, which he says on page 70.
Pleasure.
On page 70 is Eros.
Yeah, Eros, yeah.
Yeah. And so I thought that for me, that was very significant and interesting,
Mm-hmm.
especially in view of what's happening in, at least, I'll just say very briefly, in my church, where there's a reaction, a very, very strong reaction against that interpretation of the gospel, or the interpretation of Jesus, let's say.
Interesting.
That is absolutely revolutionary and based on critical theory, as it comes from the theologians in Latin America, who are very aware of what we're studying.
What about Tillage?
I'm sorry.
Paul Tillage,
Oh, yeah.
Mm.
Well,
who was German.
yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Or Tillage, I guess is
Yes.
correct.
Oh, here it is. Oh. So they don't want to hear about Jesus being a nonviolent revolutionary, is that what you're
No,
saying?
they don't. They did. And at first I misread this. I didn't see that it was actually published in 1955, and I only saw 1974, and I thought, oh, he's writing in 1974. 1968 was when the Catholic Church in Latin America adopted liberation theology. The Council of Bishops there in 1968 adopted the preferential option for the poor. And then after that, a tremendous reaction, because it influenced everybody in Latin America.
Right.
You can't explain Nicaragua without liberation theology. You can't even explain Venezuela today.
People like to talk about Latin American theology in terms of Guterres.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. But there's a whole cadre of people that he inspired, but that came after him, and that are very much more analytic than he was in terms of social analysis and the use of Marxism to interpret the reality of Latin America, and then to bring that into the light of the liturgical, or let's call it the Gospels.
Catholicism has no social theory. Christianity has no social theory. It's not that they have no theory, they have theology, but no social theory. So once you get into the struggle of the poor, of the workers, then you have to reach out in different directions.
Yes.
And it's also true that in Latin America, liberal democracy, which is celebrated in the United States but not practiced, except in the most narrow sense, liberal democracy does not proceed from social theory. It is deeply indebted to political theory that comes out of the English and the Western European generally tradition, particularly John Locke, but no social theory. Can you imagine what the difference between social theory and political theory is? You can imagine this.
Yeah.
You can articulate it.
Well, I would say social theory is broad and encompassing the totality, whereas the political theory is probably very specific and in terms of its scope. I'm not sure.
All right. What is political theory referred to in the whole tradition of political philosophy and political theory? What is its subject matter?
Government, the state.
The state and the individual, and her or his, particularly his, because women couldn't vote, relationship to the state, and the proper way of making state decisions which involve sections of the population, but not the whole population. And so what you get coming down essentially to Marx and Hegel is one version of political theory or another, which is one of the reasons that you have in the social sciences, psychology, and then sociology, anthropology, economics. You have all of these specialized disciplines, but political science is a science of the state. One of the problems with social theory was that it more or less ignored the state except as a generalized phenomenon and more or less as an enemy. It did until pretty recently. And he's got some, I'm sorry you didn't read it, but he's got some controversial formulations there. Do you remember what controversies he invokes? Well, you can take one on just one on Roman numeral 2223, and start from the middle of the page. Well, start from the top. Can the outcome for the near future be in doubt? The people, the majority of the people in the affluent society are on the side of that which is, not that which can or ought to be. And the established order is strong enough and efficient enough to justify this adherence and to assure its continuation. However, the very strength and efficiency of this order may become factors of disintegration. Perpetuation of the obsolescent need for full-time labor in a very reduced form will require the increasing waste of resources, the creation of ever more unnecessary jobs and services, and the growth of the military or destructive sector. Escalated wars, permanent preparation for war, and total administration may well suffice to keep the people under control, but at the cost of altering the morality on which the society still depends. Technical progress itself a necessity for the maintenance of the established society fosters needs and faculties which are antagonistic to the social organization of labor on which the system is built. In the course of automation, the value of the social product is to an increasingly smaller degree determined by the labor time necessary for its production. Consequently, the real social need for productive labor declines. 55. More productive labor in the United States than in its whole history. And the vacuum must be filled with unproductive activities. An ever larger amount of the work actually performed becomes superfluous, expendable, meaningless. Although these activities can be sustained and even multiplied under the total administration, there seems to exist an upper limit to their augmentation. The limit would be reached when the surplus value created by productive labor no longer suffices to pay for the non-production work. A progressive reduction of labor seems to be inevitable, and for this eventuality, the system has to provide for occupation. Without work, it has to develop needs which transcend the market economy and may even be incompatible with it. The affluent society is, in its own way, preparing for this eventuality by organizing the desire for beauty and hunger for community, the renewal of the contact with nature, the enrichment of the mind, and honors for creation for its own sake. Art for art's sake.
Is this part of that?
What?
Is this part of that literature that became so prevalent at the beginning of the 1960s about what kind of work are we going to do when the computers take over?
And what kind of work are we doing?
Yes, harder work.
Superfluous.
Instead of saving us work, we're working longer hours instead of shorter hours.
Well,
Someone wrote a book called The Jobless Future, actually.
Jobless Future, that's
Yeah.
wrong.
Yeah.
He wrote it.
We have more jobs under Obama and Trump than we have had for years.
Right.
Yeah, but there's a secret to that thing. What's the secret?
Oh, God. Well, the terrible jobs.
Terrible jobs, useless jobs,
Useless,
and part-time
superfluous.
De-skilled.
labor is now rampant.
Mind-numbingly useless.
Unorganized. Like
What'd you say?
Mind-numbingly useless. Bullshit
Right.
jobs.
De-skilled and
Jobs which-
non-unionized.
Right.
Accomplish nothing and you know they don't.
So,
28 hours is what a lot of employers are employing people for, and paying them $10, $11 an hour, sometimes 12,
right.
and no overtime.
People,
Then the next shift starts. 28 hours does not qualify in New York State for unemployment insurance.
right. A huge portion.
30 hours qualifies for unemployment insurance, so fewer and fewer people are getting 30-hour-a-week
Right.
jobs.
Right. And a huge portion of retail workers are used to being called up an hour ahead of time. You know what I mean? Like people,
Just
come into
in
the store
time.
when we call you, that kind of crap.
I think it's interesting too that especially since September 11th, that as the economy has reflected these kinds of jobs, produced more and more of these kinds of jobs, more and more real wealth and fictitious capital is being invested in the repressive apparatus. That, when Marcuse is writing this, the affluent society is still
This is
sort
the
of
peak of-
delivering the goods.
yeah.
enough so that he can talk about the sort of, to some degree, fading into the background of direct repression.
But
where-
the second most controversial point is that the weaker the forms of social rule become, the more brutal is the society.
perfect
The
sense.
destructive purpose of the society.
That seems so obvious.
Well, that has, and he goes into such great detail about how it's related to energy and action and suppression and personal suppression.
And repression.
Yeah, and introjection.
Introjection.
Right, and heteronomy.
What is the difference between internalization and introjection?
Oh, God.
Marcuse uses introjection, not internalization. Anybody want to talk about the difference?
Don't remember at all.
Liberals talk about internalization now all the time.
Is internalization seen as more of an individual process or introjection?
More of what?
An individual process or introjection?
Internalization is individual, introjection is also individual, but it's also social. But what is introjection?
It's taking in an external regulation or law or system of thought or being, whereas internalization, I think, is, it may be generated by yourself but held internally, whereas interjection is imposed. But
Yes,
I
the
mean,
difference
chosen
is
but imposed.
Introjection
Yeah.
implies taking on the values of the other.
Yeah,
Internalization may not.
right. Okay.
Law and order, the rule of laws. Those are examples of introjection.
Mhm.
Is introjection more active than internalization? Internalization is something more or less passive. All of a sudden you
Yes,
have the boss inside, but introjection, you've decided, I want the boss inside.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the
That's a good
liberals
description.
I
like,
want a good job, and
Yeah.
that's my father's horizon. Yeah.
the liberals like internalization because it erases social forces, it erases the oppression.
Erases social forces, and it becomes a version of fourth-rate psychology.
Mm.
And the strength of the individual.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's right.
Right,
yeah,
right.
Fourth-rate
Right.
psychology.
Yeah, exactly.
It's all about the individual.
Marcuse does not cease in this section and in much of his work, including One-Dimensional Man, to berate individual psychology for its lack of a social perspective
Mhm.
on individual life. Can you imagine? And it would not only apply to psychology today. It would apply to it would apply to medicine.
Mm-hmm.
It would apply to a large extent to education. That we're really talking about individuals advancing.
Right.
Or we're talking about the access that poor people, especially blacks, Latinos, Asians, access to education, access to schooling. I have had a good joke. I've always used this joke, and I get, and I'll tell you the latest version of it. People praise my intelligence, and I say, whatever intelligence I have is owed not to my brains, but to the fact that I never went to school beyond high school, really. I taught
That's
beyond
true.
high school, but never went to school. I taught myself
Wow, it's really true.
because I had connections to whatever there was in the decrepit Marxist movement, namely the communist parties, all of them the socialist parties, Socialist Workers Party, the Communist Party. But I did. But I picked things up and corrected what was mistaken or inadequate or insufficient. I corrected it in process. I still am insufficient, but I corrected it in. But the self development within the framework of collective organization and practice, much better than schooling.
Stanley, you're reminding me of the book you recommended that I read,
What book was that?
The Knowledge Factory.
The
and-
Knowledge Factory?
Yeah, and
Who
on
would
the-
read that piece of shit?
On the
Just
first
kidding.
page, you describe education as, at its best, being the process of accommodating that education to the status quo.
The first page?
Wow,
Slow reader.
sounds like a smart guy.
Now, here's an interesting anecdote. I may have mentioned it somewhere down the line. So, the Chinese have bought the Knowledge Factory. Now, this is to say, a Chinese publisher has paid me to give them the right to translate into Chinese and to publish the Knowledge Factory.
Wow.
And in China, you don't unless it's an underground publisher who wouldn't have the pittance that they're giving, but it's not a pittance in China. You know, they have adopted the first page as their light.
Their marketing tool?
Sorry?
Their marketing tool?
Marketing tool? I don't know.
Beyond that, I'm
Unless
sure.
they're using me as the enemy
Right.
Could be.
to read Mein Kampf, they read Knowledge Factory.
Stanley, can I ask you a question about interjection?
Sure.
Like compare and contrast Foucault's internalization of disciplinary organizational structures
Discourse.
to interjection, that we don't need the cage anymore, we put ourselves in the cage. Is that interjection?
No, introjection. Introduction is the deepest level of internalization, which has widespread social consequences. It is not an individual. It's always it's an individual manifestation of a very profound social structure. The social structure is how the consciousness industry operates. By the way, there's a very good book translated from the German by Hans Magnus Enzensberger called The Consciousness Industry. It's a very good book. I don't know what happened to Hans, but he came to the United States in the 1980s and had already written The Consciousness Industry. His book didn't get published till the 1990s and was very poorly distributed. But that's a very important question. And that question is the one that the pseudo-Marxists who call themselves Marxists totally ignore. Right? And I will be dogmatic. Anyone in 2018 who stops at political economy, not does political economy, stops at political economy and refuses psychoanalysis, whether you take it in one version or another, and refuses the social theory, which is the theory essentially of the reproduction of everyday life, and refuses Lefebvre, who's the great theorist of the reproduction of everyday life. Those people are, to use a complicated phrase, pissing in the wind. That's what they're doing. You know, they're not doing anything except reinforcing the most dogmatic version of Marxism. And it's widespread.
Yeah.
Denial of psychology, calling it bourgeois craft, whatever its version, and trying to find the contradictions of capitalism exclusively in processes of accumulation.
Stanley, so this raises a question I was going to ask. When I was growing up and learning some of this stuff, it never occurred to me that Marxism and psychoanalysis were enemies. And I since learned that there are people,
enemies.
but okay, but they're not, right? Because they can be
Of
used.
course, they're not really enemies,
Right,
but they position themselves to a large extent as adversaries, if not enemies.
I was just going to ask if you could talk a little bit about that. Maybe not now, but
Well, I have no problem talking about it. Marx dies in 1883. He has an implicit psychology which people like Michael Schneider in Germany, Adorno and Marcuse in particular in the United States and Germany develop, but it's not explicit. Because it's not explicit, the key to dogmatic Marxism, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but if this is all they do, it is dogmatic and a bad thing. It's volume 1 of Capital. You read volume 1, and you read maybe volume 3, and you learn that in some quarters, the crisis of capitalism consists in the falling rate of profit. And the falling rate of profit is caused by accumulation outpacing living labor because of automation, primarily. Therefore, what you need to do is study Marx and almost nobody else, and Lenin sometimes, and in the old days, Stalin and Trotsky. Trotsky never said a word about the psychoanalytic dimension of repression and exploitation. Lenin read Hegel, The Science of Logic, in 1915 and 1916, and there's a whole conspectus, volume 38 of the collected works, of Lenin's notes on Hegel. The only thing that even comes close is in Lenin is State and Revolution, which was 1917, which can be taken as a contemporary attempt to introduce some elements of psychology into Marxism. But once you get to Stalin, and Trotsky, you get rid of all that shit. Have you all read a lot of Trotsky or any of it?
a little.
What have you read?
Cultural stuff.
I read History of Russian Revolution. I forget
Yeah.
it.
Well, that's
Bits and pieces.
The History of the Russian Revolution. He's got a beautiful book, though. Literature and Society. It's a terrific book.
Huh.
It's got psychological overtones all over the place.
Wow.
But never a explicit attempt. It was 1923
I'm
to
sorry,
address
what,
psychoanalysis. What?
what's the title that you just said?
Literature and Revolution.
Okay,
Yeah.
It's a critique, actually, of economic reductionism and an appreciation of the role of literature in the formation of consciousness.
And this is Trotsky.
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Trotsky.
Trotsky,
Yeah,
yeah.
wow.
But since he solved all of the problems with literature and revolution, he never went back to it.
It's probably how he
It
thought
was
about
all
it.
about the terrible record of Stalin. He called his movement Bolshevik Leninism. Bolshevik Leninism. It was a strategic theory of revolution which was premised on the defeat of the Stalinist control of the world's proletariat and the substitution of Lenin and Trotsky for Stalin. Actually, he made a very profound mistake, and it was calling in 1938 for a fourth international without a mass base for his movement. Without a mass base for a fourth international, it becomes basically a fantasy. But a fantasy which doesn't match Marcuse's conception of fantasy.
Yeah.
It becomes an excuse. In the United States and in France, particularly, but also in other places, there were groups that refused Trotsky's call for a fourth international and formed their own groups. In the United States, the main figure in the split from Trotsky on that question, and then it turns out on a lot of questions, other questions, was Max Shakman, who's taught almost nowhere. Max Shakman was a top figure in the U.S. Communist Party. He went, in the 20s, he went with Trotsky and became a top figure in the Socialist Workers' Party, and then split with the Socialist Workers' Party. The contribution in the Independent Socialist League, which he founded, was to try to come to terms with the cultural and political dimensions of the various countries within which revolutionary socialists functioned. He came to the conclusion that in the United States, which he lived in, after a while, the revolutionary movement had to try to build a mass base by splitting the Democratic Party from itself. And so his people entered the Democratic Party. One of them was somebody called Michael Harrington, named Herbert, who basically wrote a book that became a bestseller, and also a series of books on socialism in the United States, which never got any play. The book that he wrote was
Other America.
The Other America. And he himself entered the Democratic Party, actually became a confidant of John F. Kennedy, but not of Lyndon Johnson. He'd had a relationship to Lyndon Johnson. He was a promoter of the war against poverty, the war on poverty, which was developed in the Johnson administration, but was born in his book, The Other America. He became also a frequent traveler to the Democratic Party convention, where occasionally he was awarded a platform to talk about the necessity for social change to Democrats. The Democrats are hardly a liberal organization. In fact, it is a coalition which no longer has the South in it, except a more or less middle-of-the-road South. They're fighting that fight in Florida right now. This guy who got elected to Senate in Alabama would have been called a moderate Republican 25 years ago, or 30 years ago. He's now a Democrat. Yeah.
This is a good segue to go back to your original question and the book,
Yeah,
too.
what was the question? I just sort of lost track of the question.
What did you say?
What was the question again?
Well, I was asking about Marxism versus psychoanalysis, Marxism and
Yeah,
psychoanalysis.
yeah.
The
Okay.
the two questions I showed, the left split from Trotsky and the Fourth International concept, and the second question
That was the second and
should
third.
it
The question
enter-
I'm dying to get to is your first one, which is about this book. And because there were three major themes in it, and you gave me a good segue with what you were talking about, because I've just been sitting here like this. And the segue was when you started talking about Harrington and moderate Republicans. But what I found exciting in this book, three things actually, but I'll just bring up
You
one.
mean Eros and civilization?
Yes, this was just what the doctor ordered for me. It really was. Number one, in Freud's group psychology and the analysis of the ego, he spent a lot of time with Le Bon's The Crowd.
Mhm.
And it was in the crowd that the idea of an administrative caste was cast inside me.
Mm.
Now this one, when he, number one, for me, talks about administration, and there were just two little, you don't have to turn to
The
it.
the total administration.
The administration which preserves the life of society and the laws, there is no freedom from the administration and its laws because they appear as the ultimate guarantors of liberty.
What page is
That's
that?
on 83. 89, the whole thing, and when he talks about sadistic principles, since I've just spent 5 years in weekly rotation as an ATR in the Bronx and have lived under scores of sadistic principles.
What page is that?
ATR is
89.
what? What's ATR?
Oof.
Could you read some of it?
Okay, we'll get back to that in mind. Let's stay,
Okay.
that's why I just want to stick
Okay,
with
okay.
it. It means absentee teacher in
Ah,
reserve.
okay, good.
It's where we go
Got
when
it.
they close the schools.
So,
They have names though,
okay.
and that's why I'm so, but the administration goes on. I don't know if I'm ready to read, but I'm from 89, the whole page of 89, I'd ask you to just skim it quick. But important in terms of personally, it's the pain, frustration, impotence of the individual desire. And that wouldn't even be the one, powerless before the movements and laws of the apparatus itself. And that's what I've been living with because, and I think Marcuse, who I shouldn't speak for him, but I think one of the questions to grapple with was how the Nazis took off their uniforms and put on suits. How this administrative caste continues and perpetuates itself, and the individuals give up their freedom. This is a big part of it too. To briefly say what an ATR is, an ATR was a teacher with seniority in a school, in a building, where people would work for 25, 30 years and then put their lives. When the school is closed, which they all were, those people have to report weekly to wherever the computer sends them and be there at 8 o'clock in the morning whether they like it or not. And it's been hell. So I got out, but I'm not over it yet.
Wow.
And this is why I say this was a good reading for me
Wow.
in terms of that one concept. Administration, the second concept I'd get into was being guilty because you're watching this horrible thing going on and doing nothing.
That's the third concept. The second concept, I'm not saying we shouldn't talk about it, is the notion of domination
Mm.
as
Yeah.
compared to exploitation.
Right.
And surplus value.
Surplus repression
Yeah.
I thought that was just an amazing concept. And if I could just, I don't think I'm changing
Surplus
the subject for him, but a segment after he introduces the idea of surplus repression, which I thought was just mind-boggling, is on page 36, and it's about domination
Yeah.
and how it differs from the rational exercise of authority, something I had never thought about. I thought this was just an amazing insight. He says, domination differs from the rational exercise of authority. The latter, which is inherent in any societal division of labor, is derived from knowledge and confined to the administration of functions and arrangements necessary for the advancement of the whole. In contrast, domination is exercised by a particular group or individual in order to sustain and enhance itself in a privileged position. Such domination does not exclude technical, material, or intellectual progress, but only as an unavoidable byproduct while preserving irrational scarcity, want, and restraint.
Right.
Like, boom.
Yeah.
I think maybe one of the connections
That's
between all of these conversations is that, Stanley, I think you were describing that line in Marxist thought that sort of says that psychology isn't necessary because the actions and beliefs of the workers are going to be explained by economics. And one of the things that Marcuse is trying to do here, which is introduced in the first few pages and connected to the concept of interjection, is that we need to understand, Marcuse suggests, the way that principles like social relations, like domination, aren't simply, as you said before, Stanley, internalized in a way that's separate from sort of the fundamental construction of the human, but actually becomes part of the character structure, so that like instincts in the individual
That's right.
and generally are
Right.
fully changed and modified at a biological level. And so there's one branch of thinking within Marxism that ignores all of that, and
Right.
Michael Harrington is part of that. And then there's
Right.
and that's kind of the
Right.
relationship between psychoanalysis and Marxism.
Right.
And
I'll give you a concrete example of interjection.
Yeah.
A professor says, I have a good job.
Well,
Well,
says
says the man who is a professor.
is it an example that I
No,
tell?
but, I mean, the thing is, man, what we're offered, whether you're a professor or a factory worker or a retail worker in a department store or on the other side of the computer and working for Amazon, we're offered what Marx used to talk of as wage slavery. Wage slavery means that we are dominated because we're dependent without critique. Or what we have done is we have translated what we're offered into more than a relative benefit, in which you can say working as city tech is not the same, not as regimented as working in the public school system of New York, but I'm still a wage slave. I don't control my own situation to a large extent. The graduate school, we control our own situation, except we have to give people grades. We have to turn them in. But that does not obviate the fact that people who work in elite institutions, although they're probably middle class, that's a whole conversation what we could have, are still in the last analysis enslaved by a system of domination.
But isn't it true that, at least at the university and college level, the faculty does have a lot of power to direct their own fate.
As
They
long-
make decisions.
As long as they're
Look,
afraid
the
of
adjuncts-
their decisions.
No, I mean, I'm talking about, I guess where I was, there weren't so many adjuncts. I think adjuncts are another case.
73% of faculty are adjuncts, so
At this point,
if
oh
you're
my
talking
God.
faculty, you're talking proletarians.
No, but-
You're
well-
Uber driver
No, but
teachers.
Yeah.
yeah, but I think it's a good point that there's
May I?
privileged. I mean,
Since I
some
was
people
both,
have more.
Since I was both, as an adjunct, you still, maybe you're lucky to get a job, you're teaching, you're moving on, but you're not getting the health, the benefits, what you sell your soul for as a teacher, because you need a pension sometime. So for like the last 15 years or so, you need that pension when you're 50 as compared to your 30. But there's a difference between, they're trying to say, there's a difference, what Stanley's talking about in terms of domination, the teachers and the public school system is being dominated more than an adjunct would be, because maybe if you're good, you find a job someplace else.
Well, and also.
Or you're allowed to go someplace else. As a teacher, as an ATR, you have to go to where you're assigned. No freedom.
And then, I mean, I think part of the point is one of the reasons that we don't see a mass, a general strike by adjuncts throughout the country, because this is obviously an unfair situation, is that that form of domination is part of who we are.
Yeah,
So we
yeah.
don't recognize it as something that
You learn it
should
from
be
day
done.
one.
Let me end on a
It's being
happy
built
note,
into
if
us
I
in
may.
such a way.
We introjected domination so badly that we accept the fact that that it was bad luck that we didn't get a full-time job.
Right. It's my
Or
fault.
that we're
Let
lucky
me-
to get
let
that.
me- Let me take up this question because it's not small potatoes. I'm still on committees, so I got a proposal from a student which one person, two people on the sociology faculty would be able to read. Two people. I know them both very well. And if neither of them is on what is called the faculty, the faculty membership committee, the professors are likely to turn it down and say, rewrite this in sociologies. This is not sociology. This is from Marxism. And I'll see. I asked him very closely. The chair. I'm not the chair of this, but I am the chair from his point of view. He's got a very nice person as his chair. I said she must understand that she's got to walk in to that meeting, faculty membership meeting, which is about his dissertation. She's got to be able to say, I've done it 100 times. Blow it out of your ass. I've actually said that once or twice.
But you've said it figuratively many times.
But if you can't do that, and you're polite, and you might find that you're an instrument of the domination of people who don't accept the fact that they're dominated in the first place, which is these committees that are drooling hostile to anybody who's got a critical bone in their body.
Yeah.
See, I think in sociology, political science, psychology, at least, economics, anthropology is different. You may hate anthropology, but anthropology will be tolerant of deviance. The others will call this deviance and dismiss it. But in those four disciplines, psychology, sociology, political science, and economics, you have very few places in this country where even the privilege of being dominated and accepted has been deprived to you. You have to be dominated in the sense of introjection. You have to believe that the main theory of social theory of sociology, or which is Durkheim and Durkheimian, is the only possible theory, whether it be in the mathematical version or the positivist version, or just interviews that you interpret. You can't imagine how many schools there are that will not permit that kind of thinking.
Yeah.
And there's a real impact then on strategy, right? When we think about movements that can or should exist among populations of exploited workers, like, for example, adjuncts. If we think that they've simply internalized that domination, we're going to approach movement building in a different way than if we think that that domination has been introjected and has really fundamentally changed the way that that population sort of exists and experiences themselves in the world.
Where are you involved in university?
Yeah.
Which school are you at?
Rutgers.
Yeah, okay, just because at CUNY, this is a major debate.
Yeah, I'm
yeah.
a CUNY grad.
Yeah. So it's just a major. I don't mean it's just like the 7,000 or strike question,
Right.
and I don't think our union has the power to pull it off. I mean, and people can talk 7,000.
but
they can.
the
But I
question
just
is,
want to
do
let me
the-
finish. They talk it, but we don't have the power to pull it off.
Why not?
You know why not?
Yeah, why not?
Because our membership won't sign off on
the
it.
power.
Well, I'll tell you, as a chapter chair at City Tech, I could not get my membership to sign off on a strike.
But that's a different story.
And I don't think we could actually have, after the DWU history, I don't think we, as a union, would survive. Although I think we should get rid of the Taylor laws, but that's not so easy. But I don't mean to interrupt. I just, it's something that is, it's one thing to talk about it, it's another thing to be able to successfully do it.
Well, I think the point is that Marcuse should give us a path to better understand why
Okay.
it's so difficult to organize.
Right.
Yes.
Because
Right.
you can't simply say to these folks,
Does it-
but look at all of the ways you're exploited, and then expect them to say, oh my God, I am exploited,
Right.
I'm going to go do something
Right.
about it.
Yeah.
Because it's not simply a matter of an internalized concept, it's something that's a part of who they are
Yeah.
fundamentally.
Yeah, and if
Leave
I
it to
can
their
just
fathers.
go, I agree with what you're saying, because I'm not saying to you, no, that's not an appropriate goal.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is that it's the subjectivity, which I think
Yeah.
you're talking about, of the adjuncts, which is the barrier, not the will among a militant minority to strike. I think it's the subjectivity of the adjuncts. And I think that one of the things that I learned in doing some research is that, or learn from Stanley really, is that unless and until adjuncts view themselves as a class,
Yeah.
self-constitute themselves as a class that has more in common with a fast food worker than with a tenured professor, then, there's not going to be any movement on this front. And I think it's kind of impressive that SEIU, which is pretty a shit union, but they seem to be moving in this direction because they have this Fight for 15 movement for faculty. And they're actually making actions of fast food workers fight for 15 and fight for 15,000 per course for adjuncts,
Wow.
which actually puts them at parity.
Wow.
It's very aspirational.
Oh, interesting.
And it's not happening. But I think that that's part of what, the answer is that
Right.
if adjuncts still see themselves as individuals that might, make it to a tenured position, then it's awesome.
Take this as a problem. In the State University of New York, and in CUNY, which is part of the State University, there's a 3 or 4 class system. In the faculty, there are the people who teach graduate students and get favors from the administration. There are the people who are consigned to full-time teaching of undergraduates. There are people who are assigned full-time teaching to community college students, and then there are adjuncts. The adjuncts are fourth-tier teachers, and they would rather be adjuncts than make a living.
Mhm.
That's the part that you were talking about, David, which is that you can't ignore the phenomenon of introjection. I've been told by very good people that any inference that places responsibility on the most exploited is reactionary.
Oh, yeah. You mean responsibility for their own domination?
Yes. Well, at some point, domination doesn't work unless people take responsibility for it.
Right.
I don't know whether you know this, but in 2012 I published a book on C. Wright Mills, who never walked a picket line,
Really?
and says in his papers that he never voted. And he's the most important sociologist of the late 20th century in the United States. Although he died in 1962. Mills is an example of a guy who came to regard himself as a plain Marxist, he called himself, which implied that he was also a socialist. And also thought that graduate teaching was basically a waste of time for him, but also a waste of time for students. If you have the freedom, which is rare, but it does exist in some places, the limited, narrow freedom of being able to teach what you want, you have transcended one of the elementary aspects of domination. The larger abstract conception of domination still exists, but you've transcended part of it. But most people don't have that option.
Stanley,
Don't have that option.
can I pick a fight with you?
Why not?
I'm not even sure it really is a fight, but here's a thought that I think relates. Interjection, let me say it differently. Eric Olin Wright used to talk about contradictory class locations.
Yeah,
So-
I know.
Okay, so I think that's not a bad way to talk about the relatively privileged, at least part of the faculty, or even faculty in general, is that they're both management and worker, right? Isn't
And
that?
who is that? Every full-time faculty member, right?
Well, I guess I'm thinking full-time faculty, yeah.
Yeah. And what do they manage?
Or tenured, huh? What's that?
And what do they?
Well,
what's the management?
my language,
worker?
I'm saying-
I know the book. I know the articles from which the book was there. I never accepted that.
So just finish the thought. I thought that was a way of talking about introjection. That these people have internalized, and to some degree, it's true that they are part of, they're privileged or part of management or have some say over their job.
That's true. Well, you know, I've thought about this, and I think it's also true that most faculty do not need tenure. Of course, they have nothing to say that is.
Threatening.
That's introjection.
That's threatening.
What?
That's introjection.
Yes, I know.
That's a great
They have
example.
nothing to say. They believe what they're doing is in the best of all possible worlds, given the circumstances. They think there is a deviance. They think that psychoanalytic and Marxist, both, views within the academy are deviant. Some think they're worthy of being defended. Some believe that they should be sanctioned out. But why would you fire somebody who done exactly what you wanted them to do?
The hardest people to organize at the college as a chapter chair are the department chairs, because the adjuncts understand they're being fucked. It's hard for them to get to the meetings because they're so busy. But the chapter chairs have become de facto administrators. But I'm like, you guys are workers, and they're every single summer they're pushing into your time and making you do little extra favors in time, extra administrative tasks. You have to come in to do your emails. You can't do email at work. And I'm like, you guys can push back if you organize with me, but I've got a meeting coming up with them and they're terrified. And they say, oh, the union has come. And I'm saying, no, we are the union. No, this isn't, don't just the union, it's a we. And yet getting them to own the we, I mean, if you guys have tips.
And somehow that rational argument doesn't seem to make an impact.
No, they're like, it's on me. I'm the hired hack. I'm the hired fighter.
And here's an example of close reading. Marcuse has made a vital distinction between rational argument and irrational and rationalism and rationality. Rationality is the use of argument as excuse.
Yeah. Okay.
Rational is reason regardless of excuse.
Wow.
But many people are engaged in versions of rationality.
Wow. Yeah. Yep. We learn it from birth.
Yeah. Play well with others. When I was reading this, I originally read this with you in 2005, and in my second reading, I find it harder this time.
Good.
Yeah, it's a harder, it's a harder book this time, and maybe it's just getting back into repressive desublimation.
Well, you're getting smarter now.
That is what that means.
I mean, I don't know, did anybody else have that experience? It's not...
Opposite for me.
It was
Yeah,
easier
kind of the
this time.
opposite.
So enlightening.
I mean, not to say it wasn't enlightened, but it was... I didn't always follow it.
But to carry on a little bit, I was happy as a clam as an adjunct. So it's hard for me when I hear about repression, because I worked at Stevens Tech, I worked at Cooper Union, worked around. I had a ball and made the courses that I came from inside.
Right.
So from that to becoming a teacher,
I see.
where now you're constrained, and I've spoke before too, it's not just the pension, it's health. What you don't have is health benefits,
Right.
that you need in this world.
Yeah.
But to go on the happy side, since I did retire, at least my phone is ringing 12 times a night. As a substitute teacher in my neighborhood, I can walk to work and teach 3rd, 4th, 5th grade
Right.
at my leisure and
Yeah.
whenever I want to. But again, subs don't get benefits, they don't get
Yes.
this or that.
Yeah.
So it's, as far as being an indentured servant, which it is to be a public school teacher, at least put in or the city, the civic, and I want to stay with that with Stanley. Once you put your time in, at least, hopefully, you'll have a union that gave you good health benefits and your teeth don't fall out and you're in good shape.
Yeah.
So, but there are 3 levels. There was the sub, the adjunct, and the teacher, and yours too.
Yeah.
But right now, I'm still recovering. I'll admit it, because then I confessed to the father last week. It's been hell, just going to a different place every week, seeing the horrible conditions and doing nothing.
You should write about this.
I'd rather talk about it and let somebody else write about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's why it's good coming here, because I need to get it out of my
I assume
system.
you've read Jonathan Kozol.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I kind of go back a little? One of the first things you said today, Stanley, if I understood, you referred to the most controversial thing Marcuse says, and then we kind of moved on. And it relates to what we're talking about, which I think is the idea that people are successfully dominated. That the phrase was, majority of people today, I'm going to butcher the phrase, but a majority of people today are fine with the way things are. He says that in some
Well, they have moments of discontent, and hardly anybody, I mean, this is really true, hardly anybody who's an active public school teacher, which is a very large profession, of over 4 million souls is making a living according to traditional standards. I was about to say something about that. You can go to a very highly rated State University of New York, undergraduate institutions, Newports, and you're a full professor and you have 30 years. How much are you making? $90,000.
Not six figures.
Right.
Not even six figures, yeah.
What?
Not even six figures,
No, $90,000 top,
yeah.
That's
which
not-
very few people get. $75,000 average. Most people who are associate professors end up about 70,
Wow.
72, something like that.
Okay.
The level of discontent, of active discontent, is always displaced. And I use this term deliberately. It's displaced to the position of women, it's displaced to the position of Latin Americans, and never, almost never, focused on the wage relation in the university system of which they're a part. Now, that's not true of 4 campuses of the state university, downstate medical doctors, Buffalo, Albany, Stony Brook, those 4. They go above the 6 figures. But for everybody else, it's and the reason that they paid lower is because they said State University is not primarily in New York State, is not primarily or almost ever in the middle of cities,
Right.
major cities like
Right.
New York.
So the cost of living's lower. So-
And the cost of living is lower, and to buy a house is very, very, you used to be able to buy a house for $50,000, $60,000. I'm talking about the late 80s. That situation hasn't existed in 30 years. But the prices of, the wages of faculty have not grown
Right.
beyond around 2% when they grow at all.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you mind if we read a little bit of the preface just for a second?
Go right ahead.
Okay, I was looking at
Where are you?
page
Wait,
10
can I
of
just
the
point,
nine-
sorry, I'm
1960
gonna interrupt you. Your preface, I think, is different than this edition.
I'm looking at the 61
I know, but I think
preface.
these guys have a later edition.
Yeah,
Just so you're
mine's
warned.
Stanley's.
Oh, yours is
The original, right?
Yeah.
I'm looking at the 61 preface. Do you
What
have the
Roman
1960
numeral?
10 in the Roman
Yeah, that works.
that works?
Yeah, because we all have the same Roman
This is
numeral.
the 66 preface. Go ahead, read it.
Okay,
So
okay.
lost.
So I was looking at the middle of the page when it starts. It is one of the most hideous forms of alienation. You guys found that?
No,
Oh.
I think we have
How far
different
into the?
preface.
into it?
Okay, how many pages? I'll tell you. It is 1, 2, 3,
I don't
4.
have that.
The
I
middle of
don't
the.
think it's in this folder.
Yeah, it's not in that. I do remember reading it though.
Because I think it's, and if anyone wants to read along, but it is one of the most hideous forms of alienation which is imposed upon the individual by his society and spontaneously reproduced by the individual as his own need and satisfaction. Far from justifying this kind of separation, Freud's concept of sublimation claims so-called higher faculties of man as susceptible to the realization of the pleasure principle, though such realization presupposes, in the last analysis, a qualitative change in the established reality principle. Consequently, instinctual liberation involves intellectual liberation. Okay, get that. And then the more so since the struggle against freedom of thought and imagination has been made into a powerful instrument of totalitarianism, democratic as well as authoritarian. Progressive desublimation accompanies the contemporary tendencies towards interjection of totalitarianism into the daily business of leisure of man, into his toil and into his happiness. It manifests itself in all manifold ways of fun, relaxation, and togetherness, which practice the destruction of privacy, the contempt of form, and the inability to tolerate silence, the proud exhibition of crudeness and brutality. Now, what I was thinking is
Trump.
what?
Trump. I mean, the last part's Trump. It's just wonderful. Anyway, sorry, go
Well,
ahead.
no. I mean, I'm just trying to. I start to lose his sense that it's really all there. That there's no way out. This sounds like the panopticon.
But this is
That's
right.
what I'm just trying to figure out. Is are there?
But that's what Stanley was talking
Because sometimes, I mean, I was just walking around in the rain and got a bagel at Jonas Schimmel, and I wasn't feeling totally oppressed. I was feeling like I was having a nice day in the Lower East Side. I was, so it is happiness is possible. Is that? I mean, aren't we? I mean, and even in the even the pleasure principle, Freud lets us know there are means of expression with protection. There's a harm. You are allowed to. He points at moments where you are allowed to express yourself. I mean, and obviously he says eat your peas most of the time.
Okay.
Otherwise,
How do you deal with walking past 20 soldiers in black with machine guns on Times Square and be happy?
I don't go to Times
It's a
Square.
constrained happiness.
It's not even that.
Here's
Yeah.
a great.
The question is.
I hear you. It bumps me out.
The question is whether or not that experience of happiness is not a result of the introjection of domination.
No,
So
but
I haven't
why-
interjected
why-
domination.
I mean,
Why can't we
you should
have
be open to the
constrained
possibility,
happiness?
for sure.
Yeah.
I mean,
This is
that's-
limited happiness.
How would you
The-
parse that?
I think part of what Marcuse is trying to talk about with the success of the affluent society, you don't necessarily need guns pointed at somebody all the time
Right.
if they're going to experience happiness while living without the option to reject the status quo.
Yeah.
So if you're going to walk around feeling happy because the culture industry
Some
gives you things
Liking
to
the
feel
murals.
happy about,
Some
and
researcher-
therefore you'll take like a break
Some-
from feeling dissatisfied rather than hitting the streets. That feeling of happiness isn't necessarily part of your freedom. It's exactly part of your domination.
Some researcher
Yeah.
found that that looking at Levittowns, that every single Levittown residence had been modified.
Yeah.
So, every Levittown homeowner or household expressed themselves, but in Levittowns. It's a perfect metaphor for what we're talking
Yeah, it
about.
is a great
People
metaphor.
are able to
Yeah.
express themselves all over the place. It's just
Yeah, yeah,
limited.
yeah.
It's limited. It's constrained, and sometimes it's used in horrible ways.
I mean, he's always,
No.
in the aesthetic dimension, he points out, we can convey the negative, and art does. And I wrote a paper about jazz and aesthetic dimension years ago, and I do still think that we can find our way out of the panopticon with our imaginations, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I would think that we do occasionally have moments where we find our way out, and you go to jazz plenty. I mean, you're
No, wait a minute. You're right, Ben. I do go to jazz concerts.
and it's not just suit jazz.
And
Suit
they don't
jazz.
think, including Marcuse, that jazz is an aesthetic expression. But they do think that art is the last refuge of beauty and truth.
Fantasy also.
Eros
But
effect
art
grows out of
really
this.
is
Yeah,
the
yeah.
material embodiment of.
But, yeah, and I think Marcuse combines art, or sees art as being a key expression of fantasy, which is the one area where there's some sense of freedom,
Yes.
at least in terms of Freud.
I don't mean this question as a joke. Would graffiti be a part of that? With the what is it, 60s and 70s graffiti explosion? Would that be part of the art that they're talking about?
Anybody want to comment on that?
Say that again?
I just thought of the explosion of graffiti in urban areas in the, 60s, 70s, 80s.
Marsha Berman
Would that
talks about
count?
the first time he went to class and he saw students doing spinning hip hop during during club hours at CCNY in like 1976 or something, and he it's one of the happy moments of his life was seeing his students coming out of the rubble, of the Bronx,
Right.
creating
Creating an art form.
this art form
Yeah.
that has become a world art, or urban music.
Yeah.
So, I continue to believe that it's possible. And that's how I've read the book before, but so I hear your argument. I hear the argument, but I think there are ways out.
I
mean,
if I could, I think it's
Yeah.
leaping a few steps down the road here, but Stanley mentioned earlier that it's considered reactionary to see people as participating in their own domination,
yeah.
right? Was that what you were saying? And I think that the truth is that that's absolutely true and absolutely can change. In other words, it's not reactionary to say it because it is not permanent. It will never be permanent. But for the moment, yes, people are very effectively often used in their own domination. It's just that I don't believe for a second that can't change.
Yeah.
Why
That's
should
it.
it?
Why should it change?
Yeah.
Because at some point, a leader or a group expresses anger in a way that is, look, historians tell us, some historians, that revolutions are sparked by a moment of hope, not despair.
Yeah.
The fact that we're all fucked is not why we rebel. It's because some crazy
Right.
person stands up on a box and says, I will take the heat, I'm going to challenge, follow me. And if he gets away with it, he lives long enough, or she, people say, well, let's try this, what the hell? And pretty soon you have a revolution. So,
And then you
I-
have an administrative class that recreates what you're
okay, and hence Camus the rebel had something
Yeah.
to say.
Over
Okay,
and over again.
but this, okay, so yes, so history is a depressing story of the cycle of elites. On the other hand, it's a not depressing story of people occasionally saying, fuck this, we're going to take a risk. And I forget their names, two co-authors of a book, The Spiral of Revolution and, oh, damn it, whatever it's called. They say that every revolution has been an improvement in standard of living and rights of human beings, whatever mess it was.
Let me say two things about that. I'm not going to take positions here. But the first, there's nobody in the Institute's orbit who thought anything that smacks of jazz or hip hop could be qualified as aesthetic dimension.
Wow.
And Adorno wrote jazz article. He wrote another jazz article, two jazz articles, spanned apart. And the last one he listened to it was Coleman Hawkins, and he thought Coleman Hawkins tried to make jazz a aesthetic object, and he failed, aesthetic expression. But I don't think he ever dealt with, at least to my knowledge, I don't think he ever dealt with either bebop or progressive jazz, or went as far as, or not to mention Coltrane.
So he was talking about swing, Adorno.
What?
Adorno was talking about swing.
That's all he talked about.
Wow.
Which
He
isn't
talked
really the
about
best
swing,
jazz.
and he called it jazz.
That's right.
And, well, swing was a form of jazz.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there was black swing and white swing.
Yeah.
And white swing was a waste of time, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Black swing was better and pointed forward. But it really broke apart with Parker. I
Yeah.
mean, with
Oh.
Miles Davis
Yeah.
and.
So he's with Count Basie.
Count Basie was on the edge too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Count Basie.
But what, yeah, sorry.
I mean, you also have to take into account that blues it may or may not be considered a form of jazz. It's certainly certainly an expression
Yeah.
which could be
Relates.
classified as art.
Mhm.
But that they gave up on jazz was had serious consequences. They really closed off a lot of intellectuals
Yeah, no shit.
from jazz, from real jazz.
Oh, really?
They couldn't listen to.
That was the first thing I had to say.
Okay.
Okay, I have one more thing. The second thing I want to say is that the problem with they had two things to demur from. One was the notion that the anti-war movement against the war in Vietnam ushered in a new era of revolutionary change. Marcuse didn't believe that.
Really?
He thought it was promising, he supported it, which Adorno did not. Nor did Horkheimer. Horkheimer got very caught up in the yellow peril at the end of his life. Yes.
Wow.
Caught up in what?
The yellow.
The yellow peril.
Oh, God.
He thought China was after Mao's death. No, but even before Mao's death,
Yeah.
that China was a terrible problem. First, it was overpopulated, but secondly, it had beliefs like in a cultural revolution, which was barbaric. He thought, and so on.
You could make that argument.
You could.
If you insisted.
Yeah, you could.
But the problem of the aesthetic dimension, I mean, there are two great, in my view, now I have a view. There are two great theorists of music in the critical theory spectrum. One of them never belonged to any of their organizations, Ernst Bloch. Who wrote A Philosophy of Music, which is in one of the volumes of his
Spirit of Hope.
His Principle of Hope,
Principle of Hope, sorry.
which is collected in Ernst Bloch on music, a collection edited by David Drew. The other, of course, was Adorno himself. Bloch was much more flexible. Adorno decided that real music ended with Schoenberg, except when Schoenberg systematized his atonal serial side into a method of producing mass music. But what's interesting about that is that having decided, and this is what Adorno said, it's in his book, The Philosophy of the New Music. Having decided that the one criterion of genuine aesthetic in music is the refusal of anything but challenge to the system, he excluded an awful lot.
Yeah.
Okay.
Bloch didn't do that. So Bloch and Adorno are good starting points for you if you want to read this. For talking about what Marxists thought about music. And then there's an American called Sidney Finkelstein who wrote about jazz. It's called Jazz the People's Music, which is a sort of a pop front piece of work, but it's not there in many respects. I don't think it's still in print, but that's what it's called. That's the name of the book, Jazz a People's Music. Anything else you have to say?
Could I bring us back to that question that you posed earlier, the difference between the first reading and the second reading of this? When I read this the first time in 1974, I read that version of the book, and I was struck by Marcuse's use of the myth of the primal horde, which seems to be absolutely central to this piece. And it struck me, though, is where does the authority of that myth come from, and how is that use of that myth different from the use of any other myth, say a biblical myth? People dismiss the biblical myth, but the myth of the primal horde, we have to take that seriously. Where did that come from? I mean, why do we even honor
It comes
that?
from theology.
Can you say more
It's a
on that?
theology, though.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Comes from theology.
But, okay, we dismiss, the culture dismisses theology. Why would we accept this as somehow a seminal myth that we should take seriously the way that Marcuse does and the way that Freud does?
Well, what you have to do in order to take it seriously is to relate it to the whole of what they're involved in. And not only Marcuse, but Tillich as another example, and of course the psychoanalytic movement in general. People, they argue, do not live according to economic criteria. Their beliefs, their values, in many respects, their allegiances, activities, are grounded in narratives, in stories, creation stories, stories of peace and war, and so on. And what you have to do in order to accept it is to take their account of the stories as a whole as a truthful account. Otherwise, you can disprove anything you want. You know, Marcuse is referring to quote unquote reality all the time, without bothering to give you data. So everything he writes is subject to the trash can from the point of view of the positivists and the empiricists. There's no data here.
Right.
It's a conception, so it's a large conception of the history of the cultural history of capitalism, which he and Adorno and Horkheimer argue implicitly as well as explicitly is equivalent to the significance of political economy. Look at the vote that got Trump into office. It was largely a working class vote. Not exclusively, but largely.
Right.
And so you have to ask the question: what do economic arguments really amount to? Oh, hi Phil, how you doing?
Hey, how are you?
Yeah, Phil.
Yeah, I know Phil. I want to go with that. A couple of years.
I don't know who's that. Is that yours?
Are we going to read more next week on this? Are we going to keep it going?
Yes, but
Okay.
I want to suggest that we do not, that the philosophical thing between 106 and 134, we don't take up unless we want to. If we want to, and read the rest of the book. You obviously can read the rest of the book. You could read the philosophical thing, but the philosophical section is really about Nietzsche. And it's something that we are not central to this course.
So what's the assignment? The same as posted?
What did you say?
Chapter 6, starting with chapter 6,
So we'll start.
as opposed to chapter
Section
5,
two.
which is the philosophical
Yeah,
interlude.
start with chapter 6. Read chapter 5 if you have the time, and if you have questions, you can put them on the table. But we're going to read the rest of the book from chapter 6.
Chapter 6 on. Okay.
Yeah.
That chapter was important for me in another one of my themes.
What, 6
The
and
idea,
5?
no, the philosophical interlude.
Yeah.
So if we're not going to address it last week, maybe we could look at it a little bit right now.
Okay.
Because the concept of recollecting the past is a way that I'm trying to get over my guilt for seeing how bad the public true school system is. And knowing how good it was and how bad it is now, people who just walk into it don't know. They don't know there were nurses. They
Yeah,
don't know
no.
there were
Amnesia.
what was there.
Yeah.
So the
No,
role
just
of
didn't have the
memory,
experience.
the need for memory in the social, to have a social consciousness, I think we need a social memory. It's part of where
It's
I'm
all over
on.
the place, George. It's all over this book on the need for a memory.
Okay.
Yeah.
But it was that actually when I just saw recollect with the hyphen, then that rang a bell for me. I'm not recollecting. I'm
I
recollecting.
resonate with that because I used to listen to radical, read or listen to radical people, and they keep talking about history, and I didn't get it. I didn't get it, and now I get it. Like it took me a while to realize how important it was.
I just want to say one more thing before we go on. There's a larger point in this book, and in other things that they write. They write over and over and over again. And it began with Marcuse. Do you know Adorno's famous expression? Philosophy lives because the moment to realize it passed. It's in Marcuse's Eros and Civilization, 15 years before Adorno wrote that.
Oh, wow.
Dialectic.
Philosophy lives because what?
Because the moment to realize it passed.
Okay.
But the moment to realize it was not determined by the economic situation. The moment to realize most politics, and as well as action, direct action, is not based on economics. It's not whether we have a wage increase or not. It's whether we feel fucked. And it's not whether the unions make us free. The best labor action of the last, well, I would say, since the strike of the UPS workers in 1997 was the teachers in West Virginia, and then beyond that to Oklahoma and so on. And they were not in union. You had a union which didn't have collective bargaining. And what that tells you, it told me, that strike didn't tell me, but I wrote a book on the subject. You may have read it or seen about it. It's called Life and Death of American Labor. The unions are a problem as well as an opportunity. That may be the contradictory class location that Eric Olin writes. The problem is they're always sitting on the workers. They're sitting on their members to try to get them to conform to the contract. At the same time, they are occasionally a vehicle of protest and of transformation.
Not wearing Fitbit. Not wearing Fitbit bracelets.
Yeah.
I just, an amazing.
What?
It's hard.
Well, it was but it was an amazing, I mean, what
What's the
an
breaking point?
It's so
what
funny.
an
It's straight up Foucault.
imposition.
What was?
Tell them, Kate.
Well, can you
Explain the
elaborate?
issue.
Oh, yeah.
All the
Forced
teachers were
Fitbits.
being required to wear Fitbit bracelets in order for administration to measure how much they moved around.
For their
how
health
much,
insurance.
how much they walked around.
They had to really.
But their benefits were
Yeah.
contingent on cooperating.
Yes.
Wear
Right.
Fitbits.
Yeah.
And what's brilliant about
Yeah.
that is
Yeah.
it's I don't,
What was
it's
the-
reasonable except that it's
Sorry.
totalitarian at the same time. I
Yeah.
can't describe it.
Reasonable.
Well, in other words, you're helping people. You actually could help people that way. It's just that's not the intent.
You can
You know what
help
I mean?
people that way if you've introjected.
Right. No, I'm saying that
Yeah.
influencing
What was the
people's
first-
habits could be good for them, but
What
that's
was
not
the first
that's not the
major
point.
action of the great industrial union organizing of the 1930s, which brought within 3 years 4 million workers into the labor movement? What was the
Healthcare.
first one?
Healthcare. Had to do with healthcare. No? Okay.
Question.
It was when the body shop workers
Sit down.
at Flint, number 4, the factory number 4, occupied the shop. Did not picket, did not have a demonstration outside, did not protest with signs, but occupied the shop
yeah.
Right.
and could not be removed.
Hmm.
There's a lot of people,
Yeah.
about 4,000 people.
Yeah.
And the second thing that happened in that context is that the governor of the state of Michigan at the time, who later on became a Supreme Court justice, whose name was Frank Murphy, refused to send in National Guards. The story is told many times in labor books that nobody knows. but there are some memoirs that tell the story pretty well. But the idea of this of the occupation came from the communist organizer. I mean, he didn't do it. He was on the outside all the time.
Well, and the next movement, of course, is to take over the business itself, right?
Well,
I mean, the way they did it
there's two
in
things
Argentina.
they didn't
yeah.
do. They didn't do that.
Yeah.
But even on an intermediate level, they didn't work. They didn't produce anything.
Right.
They didn't demonstrate that they could actually run the factory
Themselves, yeah.
themselves.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's become an ongoing issue
Mhm.
in the labor movement since then.
Except there are factories around Latin America where they've done that, right? People have
Of
taken over the
course.
factories.
Yeah, yeah.
Especially in Argentina.
Especially Argentina.
And there's
For what it's
a
worth.
movie,
Yes,
The Take.
the take.
That's Naomi Klein's
Yep.
best contribution to the movement.
Yep.
She and her husband or boyfriend
Her husband, yeah.
did a very, very interesting
Yeah.
movie, a documentary about
The Take.
The Take. Yeah, The Takeover.
It's really good.
Yeah. So then what was the first thing you talked about in the class? I missed the first
Flynn
thing.
sit-down of 1937.
Seven. My dissertation committee made me read False Promises.
What'd you say?
My dissertation committee made me read False Promises, which I think
The
is.
dissertation committee?
Yeah.
Where was
Yeah.
that?
This is at CUNY.
Hmm.
You weren't on my committee, but you were in the faculty when I was doing my degree in the 80s.
And who was that?
Well, Fran Piven.
Brand Piven.
Wow.
Later, it was. I can't think of his name. He was
Well,
chair.
she was different in the 80s.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway,
She
they
empowered.
said read this book by this guy Stanley Aronowitz, False Promises.
And who's the other one?
I can't think of the guy who was chair, and I'm blanking because I'm mad at him.
You don't remember your chair?
No, it was later.
That must
He
have been
was
a pleasant
he
experience.
was my chair. It wasn't great. Anyway,
Atwell, or no? Atwell was the chair of the department then, though.
it's the blue collar community. That guy,
Blue Collar Community?
Fazio?
You mean Bill Kornblum?
Kornblum.
Oh,
Yeah.